A brutal murder in an upscale neighborhood. The murder weapon in pieces on the floor. Incriminating evidence left behind. Police are convinced they have their man, but the suspect insists it was someone else. Who will the jury believe? Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Random acts of violence. You hear about them every day. You just never think one could happen to you or a member of your family. It's September 1992. Tuesday night at the Findlay house is a school night, like any other. Bedtime stories are over, and Alan and Madeline Findlay tuck their children into bed. Soon after, they themselves turn in for the night. Alan Findlay is a well-regarded physician in Calgary. He needs to be at the hospital early the next morning. In the middle of the night, Madeline is awakened by shouting. At first, she is confused. Then what is happening becomes all too clear to her. Someone has broken into the house. In a matter of seconds, Alan Findlay has been fatally wounded. Madeline loses her husband. Her two young children lose their father. The lead investigator on the case is Calgary homicide detective George Bushell.
We don't handle that many house break-ins where a victim that is in the household actually loses their life. Most of the suspects that do house break-ins are young. They like to get into the house during the day when most people are carrying out their jobs.
This robber chose nighttime. And for the thrill of it, thought he could even snatch Alan Findlay's wallet from right under his nose. But it was not in Alan Findlay's nature to let his family be threatened or his home be robbed.
The doctor wasn't a man to stand there and say, just leave my family alone and get out of here. And he wanted to ensure that nothing was going to happen to them. And so he went after the guy.
Alan Findlay was, above all else, a devoted family man. His murder becomes a high-profile case in Calgary. After all, if he could be murdered, no one is safe. Bushell is determined to bring Alan Findley's killer to justice as quickly as possible. He and his investigative team search the crime scene for clues as to the killer's identity.
We found a black baseball cap right where the assault took place, at the bottom of the stairs.
Inside the cap, they find a fresh piece of torn skin. They figure it's the killer's. They then turn their attention to the murder weapon itself, a kitchen knife in pieces on the floor.
The blade had been broken 3 times, which indicated a bit of a frenzied attack. The knife probably broke off in the doctor's body.
When investigators search for signs of forced entry, they find that a kitchen window has been pried open. Inside the kitchen, forensic ident officer Jim Edwards makes an important discovery. Using oblique lighting, Edwards is able to isolate an otherwise invisible clue the killer has apparently left behind.
As he stepped through the window, he transferred dust from the sole of the shoe onto the kitchen countertop and continued to step away. That dust remains on the countertop, and it's not visible without the use of a strong light source. What you're seeing in the photograph of that impression is done with that light shining across the kitchen countertop here.
Ident officers find more footprints in the flower bed. They also find smudge marks on a basement window.
When I first noticed them, I thought they were unusual. I made note of it, mental note of it, and I continued my investigation. My powdering for fingerprints. I wanted to find fingerprints.
In the alleyway behind the house, investigators find Alan Findley's leather jacket. There is an abandoned car nearby.
The keys were in the ignition. So we made the assumption that whoever did this came in a stolen car. The car was there to load up stolen property.
Police contact the owner of the stolen car. He can only find one thing missing: the leather driving gloves that he always keeps inside his glove compartment. Bushell then receives some encouraging news. Earlier that morning, police arrested a man trying to break into a student residence at the University of Calgary campus just a few blocks away. He was seriously inebriated.
He didn't have a key. He didn't have a jacket on and was cold. And he had blood on his clothes. So he looked like the ideal candidate for having just done a murder.
The murder suspect's name is Craig Koski. When Koski is taken into police headquarters for questioning, he is so drunk hours must pass before he is sober enough to respond. Police are sure they have their man. Koski tells police that his girlfriend lives on the campus. He says he's welcome there, but he didn't have his key last night. At his uncle's house earlier that evening, he claims he'd been in a fight and that the blood on his clothes belongs to his uncle. Koski's alibi checks out. Forced to release his only suspect, George Bushell is back where he started, with no idea who the killer is and no idea where he has gone. When Bushell reports back to Madeline Findley, he is forced to tell her that he has just released his only suspect. Bushell sees what Madeline must be going through. He assures her that he and his investigative team will not rest until her husband's killer is brought to justice. Bushell next tries to figure out how the killer got away. There are no subways in the area, and the buses stop running at midnight. Bushell contacts every cab company in Calgary. One of the cab drivers he talks to remembers picking up a fare not far from the Findlay house, not long after the murder took place. The driver says that the man who called for the cab used the name Sheldon. The cab driver remembers the man's address.
And we asked the cab driver if there was anything unusual about this guy's appearance. And he said, no, at first he said, well, not really. And we said, well, did he have an abrasion, anything on his forehead and that? And he said, yeah, I come to think of it, it was fairly dark, but I think there was an abrasion on his head.
When investigators descend on the residence in question, they find Sheldon Klatt, a petty thief well known to Calgary police. They ask where he was the night of the murder. Klatt refuses to answer. They ask how he came to have a cut on his forehead. Klatt again refuses to talk. But the contents of his apartment are soon speaking for him. Police find a pair of running shoes which they hope will match the footprints found at the crime scene. They also find a freshly laundered jean jacket stained with what appears to be blood. Inside the jacket, they find something else. A pair of gloves matching those reported missing from the stolen car. This is Exhibit A, a pair of leather driving gloves that leads to the killer of Alan Findlay. Even after police inform him that he's being charged with second-degree murder, Klatt stays silent. Investigators now realize that the case will be won or lost based on physical evidence. When ident officer Jim Edwards learns that murder charges have been laid and that a pair of leather gloves has been recovered, his mind immediately races back to the crime scene.
It wasn't until after the homicide detectives told me that they had these leather driving gloves seized from the suspect that I thought, those marks I saw on the windows may have been made by these gloves.
Edwards decides to do something that has never been done before. He sets out to prove that glove prints can be just as unique as fingerprints.
When we do a fingerprint comparison, we're comparing the unknown or crime scene impression to a known that we have on the police files. And I applied that same principle with the follicle ridges I found on the window to the impressions that I had made myself with that glove. This is a photograph, greatly enlarged, of an area of that impression. And you'll note here that there is definitely a seam present. I found the same unique ridge formation on my test impression, so that gave me a starting point.
Edwards is encouraged by his initial findings. To prove his glove printing theory, he logs countless man-hours consulting leather experts, veterinary pathologists, and toxicologists throughout North America. Edwards is not the only tenacious member of the investigative team. Forensic biologist Sandra Korkosh has been on the case since the beginning. She calls Bushell with the results from the DNA tests on the piece of skin recovered at the crime scene.
I talked to the detective, minutes after I pulled off the first test results, and was very excited to get a match. And that match is right here. This is the baseball cap. This is the DNA from the baseball cap, and it matches the accused.
Under Canadian law, the prosecution must fully disclose its case to the defense before a trial can proceed. When Sheldon Klatt learns about all the forensic evidence amassed against him, he suddenly rethinks his vow of silence. As it turns out, Klatt says Detective Bushell has been right about almost everything. Klatt was at the crime scene that night. He did participate in the robbery, but he did not kill Alan Findlay. Klatt says there were two of them at the house that night. His partner is the one who did the killing. According to Klatt, he and his partner in crime, Eric Haynes, had staged a number of break-ins in the Calgary area before they targeted the Findlay house. Klatt insists it was Haynes who broke into the house, while Klatt himself waited outside. It was Haynes who armed himself with a kitchen knife, and Haynes who stole Alan Findlay's leather jacket. Klatt says Haynes led him into the house. While Klatt searched the basement for items worth stealing, Haynes went upstairs. Hearing a scream, Klatt claims he rushed upstairs to find Haynes and Alan Findlay struggling violently. Blood must somehow have gotten onto his jacket during the struggle. He must have lost his baseball cap while fleeing the house. He had no idea that Alan Findlay had been murdered. George Bushell doesn't believe Klatt's story. Still, he has to prove that Klatt is lying. So what about this partner, Eric Haynes? Could he have been the killer? Once again, Bushell is forced to deliver bad news to Madeleine Findlay. Just when it looked as though they'd closed the case, Bushell has a whole new murder theory to investigate. Were there two men in the Findlays' house that night? In her initial statement to police, Madeleine said that she saw only a shadowy figure. Bushell now asked her to think back, but Madeleine's memory of events remains the same. This means that Klatt's lawyer can argue the shadowy figure did indeed belong to Eric Haynes and that Klatt, as he claimed, was elsewhere in the house at the time of the murder. Investigators suffer another setback when biologist Sandra Korkosh cannot identify the source of the bloodstain on Klatt's jacket.
Extracting DNA from denim back at that time did provide us some problems in that denim like this often extracted the dye in the denim with the DNA.
Unable to say for sure that the blood sample is Alan Findlay's, investigators now begin to hammer away at the inconsistencies in Klatt's story. Eric Haynes insists he had no part in the murder. He tells police that Klatt has done far more than simply tailor a story to fit the evidence. Klatt had recently made a direct phone appeal to Eric Haynes.
He phoned a friend and said, "Will you take this rap for me?" And the guy said, "Are you nuts?"
Klatt's outrageous plan was to confuse the jury. He figured that if Haynes confessed to the murder, but evidence pointed to Klatt, the jury would be divided and both men would go free. When Haynes rejected the idea outright, Klatt decided to go ahead and finger his former partner for the murder anyway. Haynes produces several witnesses who confirm that he was elsewhere at the time. With Haynes cleared, the focus of the investigation shifts back to Sheldon Klatt. Jim Edwards has now finished his forensic work on one of the shoe prints found at the crime scene.
This is a photograph of the footwear impression found in the flower bed below the attempted point of entry into the residence. You'll note some characteristics here that make it possible to determine a make of shoe. In this case, we're dealing with a Nike impression, and a portion of the N appears here in the upper center portion of the photograph. These are the shoes seized from the accused at the time of arrest, and you'll clearly note when examining them that the Nike trademark appears in the center of the sole.
Klatt's shoe also matches the footprint found on the kitchen counter.
I enlarged the photograph of the actual crime scene impression, the sole of the shoe, and my test impression of that sole. This shoe seized from the accused made the impression at the crime scene.
But the stolen driving gloves are Jim Edwards' trump card.
When the suspect was arrested, photographs were taken of any injuries that he may have had at the time. When his right little finger was checked on the inside near the nail, there was a slight cut noticed. And the right little finger of the glove has a crescent-shaped cut, which would indicate to me that this individual was wearing these gloves.
During the trial, the prosecution is able to argue that Klatt's attack on Alan Findlay was so violent, so brutal, that the blows forced Klatt's hand up the knife handle onto the blade itself, slicing open both the glove and Klatt's finger. That evidence is suggestive enough, but in an unprecedented decision, the trial judge allows Edwards' glove print testimony to be entered as evidence as well.
As you can see here, by the marks left by the gloves on this pane of glass, there are very unique markings left by this pair of gloves, and we could treat this just like a fingerprint. In court, I presented the glove impression evidence by way of a chart which I prepared. The points I found in the unknown are in the known as well, so they are consistent with one another.
Edwards insists that the glove print impression proves that Klatt had been at the scene of the crime. When Klatt's defense counsel argues that Edwards is not a glove print expert, the trial judge replies, he is now. Edwards' groundbreaking leather research has paid off. But will the weight of the forensic evidence be enough to convince the jury that Sheldon Klatt acted alone?
I think with the evidence we collected at the scene, if you compare it to a jigsaw puzzle, each one of these pieces of forensic evidence is a piece of that puzzle. And as you start to complete that puzzle, it becomes overwhelming.
The jury agreed. Klatt was found guilty of second-degree murder. To acknowledge both the brutality of the crime and the community's abhorrence of it, Klatt received the longest prison sentence ever given for second-degree murder in Canada, 25 years inside Edmonton Maximum Security Institution. But for Alan Findlay's family, the outcome is hardly a consolation. Because of Sheldon Klatt's random act of violence, their lives will never be the same. The stories on Exhibit A are based on true cases. The forensic scientists and investigators are the actual individuals who worked on the cases. The names of the victims are fictitious. The names of the guilty are real.